one.
Okay, so this is the third of the videos on living world, and this is the chosen ecosystem or biome, sorry, which is cold environments. And again, in a moment, I'll use the BBC bite size to go through the figures. So you've got three different aspects. You've got the characteristics of the cold environment, including things like permafrost and soils, plants and adaptations. And then you've got, of course, the idea of low biodiversity in this environment. Then there's a little bit on development, the opportunities and challenges in cold environments. The case study, which is linked on the website here, and which is available as a revision video on YouTube, is about Alaska, the North Shores of Alaska. And then down at the bottom, the idea of the risks of economic development, the whole idea of it being a fragile environment, because in fragile environment, low energy environment, decomposition, growth, really, really limited. So if we jump across to the BBC bite size page, this is the bite size section. And you can see cold environments, and we'll start with the characteristics. So the characteristics of the cold environments, they find at high latitudes, polar, and then just below polar, we've got an area called tundra, treeless plain, tundra. High latitudes, of course, mean the sun doesn't get there during the winter, and in the summer there's watery sunshine, but at least it's there for sometimes up to 30 or 40 days of continuous sunshine. So the climate, long cold winters, very, very low temperatures on average below freezing, quite dry because the air in these regions is quite cold. But of course, that which falls as precipitation stays for a long time. So you get this idea as a load of water, but actually it's either locked up or frozen, or it's not available because it's frozen itself above the ground. So we've got soils. Ironically, the soils are very rich in organic matter, but it's locked in. It's not decomposed. It can't be taken up by trees. But it's the opposite, therefore, of tropical rainforests, which have got all of that lush vegetation above the ground, but very, very infertile soils. In cold environments, you've got a load of potential organic matter in the soil, but above it, not much vegetation. And it's so cold that the rates of decomposition are so low, and there's waterlogging, that in fact the soil has a lot of organic matter, but it's locked in. Plants, typically low-lying plants, lichens, mosses, and then animals highly adapted to the landscape. Polar bears in the north, penguins in the south. Do remember that. And of course, we then have other plants and animals that we can talk about. In terms of animals, remember the value of the oceans as well in this environment. So tundra. Tundra climate, you can see here, average temperature of the Arctic is between -12 and -6, but there are 50 to 60 days of if you like, thawing of summer, watery sunshine, low angle of incidence, but enough to kickstart a short growing season. The permafrost, permanently frozen ground, melts during the summer and then refreezes from the top again in the winter. So you get this waterlogged zone beneath, which stops decomposition. And therefore decomposers are not able to do all their work. Plants are low-lying. They're called cushion plants because they sit as little cushions with the inside protected by the outside petals from the very cold weather and the wind. Some of these plants, in fact, are believed to have organic antifreeze within them to stop the leaf cells from exploding as they expand. Animals, quite a large, well-known set of animals, but not that many. It's not very biodiverse. You've got Arctic foxes, polar bears, whales, caribou, snow geese, etc. Really trying to eke their way through the winter so they can get to the summer when they've got insects to graze on, and they've also, and the insects themselves have got some vegetation to eat as well. So if we move on to look at the adaptations of the cold environment, it's really focusing on this massive limiting factor of the temperature, and the temperature regime, meaning it's very, very, very cold for most of the year. So the plant adaptations, as shown in this diagram, we have cushion plants I've already talked about, some flowering plants which are able to quickly grow, flower, take advantage of the insects that are around at the time, and the flower can track the sun and they can photosynthesize. So they perform the basis, of course, for herbivores that graze on them, and then things like your Arctic fox, which might take out your rabbits. Cotton grass, small seeds. Cotton grass is incredible. It's able to reduce its water loss and is able to grow really, really quickly and grow seeds really quickly. Very, very fast growing grass. The grasses are going to take over the world because they can survive cold temperatures, dry, they can survive fire as well. And lichens, low-lying mosses and things that sit on top of rocks in particular, and lichens will be eaten by animals such as caribou. And the caribou, of course, especially the weaker ones, you may have seen some David Attenborough, will be taken out via wolves. And wolves, of course, will hunt in packs and often will migrate. So, development opportunities. Because there's not been many humans there, there's a lot of untapped resources. And we have mineral extraction, particularly semi precious and precious metals. And already the Russians are beginning to exploit under the tundra because climate change means that they are able now to access from the Arctic Sea and be able to get in there. Energy. It may not be very, very bioproductive now, but there was a time when these areas had very warm climates and therefore there's oil and gas. And if you look at the case study of Alaska, the extraction of oil, in particular Alaska, is very important. If it's not taking out oil, then it's fishing. Those of you who watched all those programs about crab fishermen way up in the deadly seas and things like that, you'll know that in fact these areas are commercially available, especially for things such as crab, but other fish stocks. And finally now, this is a wilderness set of areas, especially Antarctica, and tourists are willing to pay a large amount of money to go and visit Antarctica on special cruises. It's something called the pleasure periphery, going to somewhere where possibly your mates have never been before. And some people will pay a lot of money to go to these very, very pristine environments. So if we go to the cold environments, so we're nearly finished now, what are the development challenges? Well, of course, the first one is extreme low temperature, which can play havoc with all kinds of building, especially if the permafrost melts, and we'll look at that down here. Very mountainous areas. So if you're going to do construction and you're working in very, very austere environments, and it's very inaccessible for vehicles. So buildings, if you build something on a layer of ground which thaws and melts and which heaves and things, you've got to try to isolate your central heated building from the permafrost. So you have to put gravel pads in or put them on stilts to let the air sweep underneath, so you don't get your warmth of your building melting the permafrost, leading to the building swaying and collapsing. And that goes for infrastructure as well. So gravel pads, warmed pipelines to allow the oil to move. And you'll find if you've got your case study of Alaska, that's one of the things they talk about is how can humans develop in this area, but also to preserve the landscape. And then finally, managing the risks. So we've got a whole idea of sustainable development, trying to sustain this cold environment. It's very fragile, which means that if there's a small disturbance, the impact will be there for a long time because growth rates are low, decomposition rates are low, and you'll end up making a long-term scar on the landscape. So everything about this has got to be looking at the fragility of the ecosystem. So technology, access to minerals has got to use high technology to reduce the impacts. Governments, international agreements such as the Antarctic Treaty down here, and the Antarctic Treaty is a very important document that basically preserves the Antarctic as a wilderness owned by nobody, owned by everybody, because people recognize that its strategic importance and its valuable minerals down there in the southern hemisphere have got to be protected. And finally, conservation groups, everything from whaling through to bird populations, through to trying to preserve underneath the ice all of the landscapes which we haven't seen for tens of thousands of years. Lots of international agreements trying to sustain Antarctica and, of course, the Arctic, which is now becoming more available because of climate change, reducing the Arctic ice sheet.